I'm an odd person to invite to an investors conference because I write so much about politics and domestic politics, but also freedoms and democracy and freedom of expression and issues as such. But somehow it is really related to the political story in Turkey. There's no doubt that this is a great time. These are good times for business, and this is a great time for in many ways, Turkey's stock is rising given everything else that's happening in the world and given the fact that there is, after much turmoil since 2013, stability is the code word. There's a government that's here elected with 50% mandate and is likely to stay for the next 4 years. So in many ways, it's good times for business. There's also no denying the fact that there's a strong leadership in the persona of President Erdogan. He runs the country in an authoritarian but popular streak. Authoritarian but popular, kind of like his old friend and now enemy Putin in many ways. But the difference is Erdogan has been able to deliver a whole lot more in terms of increasing people's, particularly middle classes, and the economic story and growth story. And also the difference is Turkey is very much part of NATO. So while stylistically, in terms of the personalized style, in terms of the illiberal instincts, you can make the comparison, Turkey is still a far better and far more free country. Nonetheless, I don't think that's the end of the story. I think we need to look at the fine print, and then I'll come back to the positive story again. The challenges over the next few years in terms of the stability picture would be for external and internal. External challenges are stuff that you already follow from the news. Basically, we are talking about a country that borders ISIS. Currently, we're sharing 100 kilometers, 98-kilometer border with the Islamic State. And thus far, Turkey's policy had been unofficially, okay, I don't like you, but I'm not going to mess with you, and you don't mess with me. This worked for a while, but it's unworkable now. Why? Because ISIS is not like that. The Islamic State is an expansionist organization. They've already carried out 3 major bombings in Turkey. Granted, it was attacks on the enemies of the government. Nonetheless, it was Turkish citizens. So Turkey is also under a good deal of international pressure to do something about sealing off its border. It's not a relationship whereby you can develop a modus vivendi and say, okay, we know you are there, but we're not going to fight you and you don't fight. But Turkey is going to be compelled to enter more and more into the fight with ISIS. We've already opened up our bases for coalition planes to go in and attack ISIS targets. That was a smart move because Turkey has to be in the Western camp, because there's no buying acquiescence from ISIS. Eventually, they would have really been more and more of a problem for us. And secondly, now there's talk of creating a buffer zone, a safe zone, a non-ISIS zone on the 100 kilometers of the border that is currently controlled by ISIS. In many ways, I hate saying this, but Turkey's predicament is like that of Pakistan. With Taliban next door, trying to develop a relationship whereby you don't really get sucked into the chaos, but there's Peshawar there, and the fighting is going on your borders. In this whole thing, different from Pakistan, Turkey will have to do more of the fighting itself. I think already Turkish planes are bombing ISIS villages and targets on the Azaz, Jarablus area. And I think over the next year or so, I predict more Turkish involvement in Syria. This is sad, but unavoidable and necessary for the world and for Turkey. It doesn't necessarily mean, it's not necessarily something that impacts the economy in a strange way, because in the past, even at the height of clashes with the PKK and PKK terrorism, somehow Turks were able to compartmentalize the highly dynamic of their economic story with security issues. Second issue I'd like to point out, other than ISIS, by the way, I mean, the world is not going to destroy ISIS, Islamic State. The whole idea is trying to contain it somehow. If they could be contained in a region and we cut off their access to the rest of the world and could be cut off, I think that would be the modest success story we can collectively claim. Right now, they have an access point into the rest of the world. And that is really across from Kilis, it's the 100-kilometer that is on our border. In an ideal world, maybe Turkey wouldn't mess with ISIS and say, you know, it's an evil force, but we're not going to touch you. But this is not possible, and we don't live in an ideal world. Turkey's alliances with the West, Turkey's relationship with the West, and Turkey's own very fragile domestic security situation does need the country to act and do something on ISIS. The second issue I'd like to point out is the Kurdish issue. Again, this was something that in the past was one where the Turkish business elite and in general Turkish citizens were able to compartmentalize. There's something out there, local insurgency, but we are busy with deals and contracts and mergers and acquisitions here, etc. We have to pay more attention and we have to do more. This is not, you cannot compartmentalize, isolate the issue to eastern parts of Turkey in this day and age. Why? First of all, it's spread across, first of all, because of demographic reasons. The country is, yes, heavily Kurdish in southeastern Turkey, but Istanbul is the largest Kurdish city. And secondly, I think because the nature of internal conflicts is changing with cell phones and technology and Twitter, and you can't just have one town under curfew for 12 days and not expect it to have a major impact on the security of Istanbul. Ideally, what Turkey needs to do on the Kurdish issue is return to the negotiating table. This was one of the best things that this government has done, starting the negotiation process with the PKK 4 or 5 years ago, 5, 6 years ago unofficially, but officially for 4 years ago. It hasn't. People say it hasn't amounted to anything, it hasn't gotten us anywhere, but that's not true. We've had 4 years of peace, and it's valuable to Turks and Kurds, to citizens and officials, to soldiers and families, and to Kurdish politicians as well. So I do hope to see us returning to the negotiating table with the PKK, but not just yet. I think these are tough times in terms of the Kurdish issue. There's a low-level insurgency going on in 10, 12 provinces right now. Places like, Turks have probably read about curfews in Cizre and Nusaybin and downtown Diyarbakir and all. And the nature of the conflict is changing, not just mountains and, not just PKK attacking troops in the mountains and troops attacking PKK up in the mountains, but it's now an urban phenomena. We're talking about urban fighting. Because of that, and because we've seen the neighboring countries very quickly, where things getting out of control in neighboring countries very quickly, I do hope that we will see a return to negotiating table next summer. It's not going to happen until then. There's a lot of stamina to keep going on both sides. But I think that there's a build-up of international pressure, particularly Americans. It was one of the things in Obama's item when he met with President Erdogan at G20. So it's something that would make things a lot smoother for all of us and for the economy. Other than this, and this is touching upon a bright point, rule of law issues. Turkey does need to fix rule of law issues. In a way, I mean, it's not just about Turkey's image. It's not just about imprisonment of journalists. It's not just about free speech issues. It's also about what you guys are doing. It's also about the economy. We do know that places like China have done better in terms of their rule of law issues and independent judiciary and whatnot. I was listening to Davutoglu, Prime Minister Davutoglu, the other night. I think that there are people in the government, Babacan, outgoing minister, was one, but I think Davutoglu is also one. There are people in the government who are aware that this needs to be done. Turkish judiciary had always been, before this government and after this government, politicized and a political play. But we have to start, now that there's 4 years of stability, we have to start rebuilding Turkish democracy. There is an intention on the part of the government to introduce a democracy package. It's absolutely important and absolutely needs to have a component on judiciary and rule of law. I mean, today's fights are something. They're petty fights between this and that, and the political fights that are very high profile, get too much attention. But they are really petty things, small things in the larger scheme of things. The larger scheme of things, the long run, is about re-establishing Turkey's institutions and independent judiciary and rule of law. One thing that's going to be helpful on this, and I really don't want to sound, I can go on and on about journalism, media, and freedom of speech issues, but that's stuff you all know, and it's also in the paper. I want to talk about how we can move forward on this. The one bright story is what's been happening with the EU, European Union. All of a sudden, Turkey's EU process with the refugee agreement is re-energized. And I find this, there's a cynical element to this, because Europeans are giving us 3 billion to keep the Syrian refugees in Turkey. But there's also a positive element in this. Turks managed to negotiate a deal whereby Europeans finally agreed to re-energize, as the word is, to re-energize the negotiation process with the European Union. We know, every one of us in this room know, that Turkey is not going to be a member of the European Union anytime soon, perhaps not in our lifetime, but at least not over the next 10 years. Nonetheless, the process is extremely valuable for each and every one of us, because it is about fiscal discipline, it's about democracy, it's about an independent central bank, and it's essentially about reform. To go back, to restart the negotiation process, even as a sort of a payment for us to keep the refugees, it's a good thing for us. Another good issue, and is very much below anybody's radar, and that's Cyprus. My generation, I've been a journalist for quite a while, and I've covered endless amount of Cyprus negotiations when I lived in New York, when I was in Washington, when I was in Ankara and all, and nobody is interested in the word Cyprus. It's a frozen conflict, it's boring and detailed and everything. But surprisingly, there is a new climate and a new momentum, and underneath the radar, everybody's radar, talks are going on, and this could be the year, 2016 could be the year of Cyprus. Why is that important? That's really a huge boost for Turkey internationally. We all need a good story, right? Turks need a good story. We need a good story. We've had too many bad stories over the last 3-4 years, and really too many people moping around, going depressed. But Cyprus could be one. Cyprus, there's a new leadership on the Turkish side and Greek side. and that makes a whole lot of difference. And there is a leadership now that's willing to do a deal, and for its own purposes. And because it wants to get out of this sense of alienation in the international scene, Ankara is also being very supportive. So possible Americans are pushing. I think Kerry was supposed to be in Cyprus today. I'm holding my breath because, as I said, I've seen rounds and rounds, but this round is actually looking promising. Now, Cyprus deal, or a deal on Cyprus, imagine what it means. All of a sudden, Turkish Cypriots, it would mean Turkish Cypriots entering the European Union. That's opening the door for people. That's just having a little bit of an opening in the door. It means accession process restarting, particularly something which is very important. Cyprus would lift its embargo, its veto on all the chapters that's been opened, including judiciary. Imagine the Europeans getting involved in Turkey's reform process again. Reform on the judiciary. I think that cannot be bad. So that, I think, is one positive note. I realize that I haven't touched upon Turkish-Russian tensions, and maybe a few sentences on that, because that's the hot topic of the day. Well, it's highly dangerous and a little bit funny in terms of the exchange between two leaders. I was talking to a Western official yesterday who said, I have never seen an international conflict like this. They're like swearing at each other on podium. And it's stylistically speaking, it's Putin's style and Erdogan's style. It's because both leaders have a personalized style of management and are macho leaders. So, you know, it's an unconventional form of tension. I think the Russians are being smart. They are the big bully in this case, and I do think they have violated Turkish airspace. I have heard again and again from different sources that they have. It's not, Turks could have not shot the plane, but I think this wasn't the first violation. But now that it happened, the Russians are being bullies and want to really deter Turkey from what they're trying to do in Syria. And to an extent, this is going to force, I think, Ankara to give up its obsession about toppling Bashar Assad, which is not going to happen anytime soon. Turkey will need to go with the international crowd, with the international scene, and accept that there will be a transition in which the outcome may be Bashar Assad stays or not, but the regime stays. And it's not fair, because too many people have died. I know it's not fair, but this is what it is. When Dayton Agreement was signed in Bosnia, it was signed with Milosevic, who was responsible for the death of tens of thousands of Bosnians and other people. But what are you going to do? It was the only thing that could be done to stop the bloodshed. In a similar case, the Vienna process is in its early stages, but it's hopeful that Americans and Russians are working together, Iranians are supporting. This is going to take time to work out. So the most ideal scenario would be 2 years. But if we can have a ceasefire in 2 years and stuff, things would look different. The world needs to stop this open wound. But the Russians are not. But the Russians privately will continue their issue with Turkey. Interestingly, while talking about economic embargoes and sanctions and this and that, they're really not touching big ticket items that are in their favor, such as pulling out of the nuclear deal in Akkuyu, such as cutting off Turkey's natural gas, etc. They're being very smart. They're putting embargoes on tomatoes and vegetables and contractors, this and that, items that are hurting Turkish businesses, but not really, not stuff that has a big dent in the Russian budget. That said, I don't really worry about the trade element of all of this. What I think the Russians will do and have started doing is respond in a totally different place and in Syria. The Russians will make it hard for Turkey in Syria. They will force Turkey to give up some of its alliances with some of the groups, the opposition groups. I think that Turkomans are going to have a hard time because the Russians are already intensifying their air campaign against Turkomans groups that are supported by Turkey, opposition groups. And I think the Russian plans are effectively trying to make Turkey's idea of creating a little bit of a buffer zone, an unofficial buffer zone, a safe zone on its own borders impossible. They are really targeting opposition groups that Turkey is working with, in addition to the oil supply and all of that. But the real Russian response will be in their help for Kurds, for the Syrian Kurds, for PYD, which currently, our border with Syria, which is long, 900 kilometers, more than half of it is controlled by Syrian Kurds, PYD, which is an offshoot of the PKK, but nonetheless is the most active force in Russia, in Syria. Turkey has said, okay, but stop here. We don't want you to expand towards the Mediterranean. We don't want you to cross Euphrates. If you do that, we're going to take you on militarily. And so the Kurds have stopped because they have an alliance with America now. They have too much to lose. They don't want to get into a military confrontation with Turkey, etc. My worry is that the Russians will try to tempt PYD, the Kurds, into moving west, expanding. And I think it's very important at this point in this sort of chess game with multiple players for the international community, i.e. the Americans, to step in and tell the Kurds, don't get into a confrontation with Turkey, don't go west of Euphrates, and hopefully their offer on the table will be more tempting than the Russian offer for the Kurds. The Kurds feel this is their time in history. We were the big losers in the 20th century. We are not going to lose this one. I'm talking about Kurds in Iraq, Syria, Turkey, collectively talking about this is our time in history. And in a way, they're right. The Kurdish issue is rising. The Kurds have an advantageous position, which is why, going back to an earlier point, it makes sense for us to ultimately go back to the negotiating table, go back to the original plan, get arm in arm with Kurds in Iraq, in Syria, in Turkey, everything, and really rebuild a fortress here in Turkey. Turks and Kurds together would be much safer and more prosperous, I think. Let me end there. I don't think there's a Q&A, right? Is there?
If you want to, you can.
If anybody wants to. Okay. So thank you.
There was a gentleman, sorry.
Was there?
Was a gentleman right at the end of the room. 1 second, a microphone is coming your way.
Maybe you can shout us.
Thank you. This is Ekim from Societe Generale. Referring to your introduction of the political landscape in Turkey in the beginning of your speech, and looking at the hugely intense agenda of this country over the last 10 years, I really want to learn, do you really believe in the impression that a single-party government will mean stability in this country, or are we going to have still some tough times?
I think we're going to have tough times unless we put our house in order, and the only way to do that is democracy. Democracy, it's become an old-fashioned notion now in international relations. A few years ago, with the Arab world, Arab Spring, everybody was talking about democracy in the international conferences that I go to. Nowadays, everybody is only talking about stability, but surely stability only does not provide stability. Without a democracy, maybe an old-fashioned notion, and it's an exhausted word, but it's still the only way to bring about stability in countries, in many countries, but also in countries that have non-homogeneous populations like Turkey. Turkey is very polarized, I don't need to tell you this, and therefore it's going to be the way it is. Lurching from a crisis to another crisis. We always are like this. lurching from a crisis to crisis. But I think it's up to us to really make it safer and more durable and more stable by continuing to argue that there does need to be a reform package and a democracy package. Am I optimistic? I'm not pessimistic, because a lot of what's been happening over the last couple of years is irrational. And I think irrationality tends to be very obvious, and ultimately in the long run people tend to go for a more rational version of things. There is a way out, and everybody knows this. Europeans are offering a life vest right now. And it's possible. I'm not terribly optimistic about the short term, the next 6 months, 8 months, whatever. But I think that we have to start doing the right thing. And that is possible. Turkey has too much talent and capital accumulation and middle class and bourgeoisie and academia and all, too much in terms of human capital to steer itself to the right position. Unlike Russia, which has never really experienced democracy, there is a tradition here in Turkey. So trying to be optimistic for the middle ground, and I mean it. I mean, if things could get someplace with Cyprus, if things could actually get to a place with the Europeans, not for membership, but even for accession talks, the situation here would improve, which would ease the domestic tensions and whatnot. İsmail.
Thank you. Also, thanks very much for joining us today. Always great pleasure listening to you. Interesting enough, I did my military service in Kosovo back in 1999, and NATO was bombing Serbia and Montenegro. And yesterday or the day before, NATO accepted Montenegro as a new member. How do you see that? So are the fronts getting more sharper, or what's going on between Russia and US, and how it's going to affect Turkey?
Well, there's an old book by Samuel Huntington about Clash of Civilizations. This was written in the 80s, and all through 90s and 2000, people attacked this book, saying, Samuel Huntington, who's a very, veteran historian, but people attacked this book saying, there is no clash of civilization. Christianity and Islam are not in clash. Confucius civilization and this is not in clash. There is only harmony and globalization and this and that. But Huntington had a point in many ways. There is a civilizational clash going on, and the people who are in the gray areas are having a tougher time. Fukuyama, when he wrote The End of History, at the end of the Cold War, thought, okay, now the Cold War ended, everybody is going to have free markets and democracy, and countries in their own speeds will evolve. American model wins. Well, it turns out not, because people have found new models, such as authoritarian democracy, elected authoritarian, not dictatorship, but not democracy, etc. So there's a lot going on in that regard. But going to Huntington's thesis of Clash of Civilization, he talks a lot about Turkey as a torn country. Torn country. Turkey is not part of the Muslim world in that sense, and Turkey is not part of the West. We are really a torn country. Our alliances are in the West, but our heart is in Cairo somehow. Yet part of the population is very westernized. If you take a day strolling around Galatasaray, we will always be this middle ground country. And because of this, we will not be part of the European Union as a full member. But we might have a privileged partnership of some sort, which is where it's heading, I think. And that is good enough for me. What's important is that Turkey is anchored in the West. And NATO is an important institution. And I think that, yes, Montenegro is part of, it's easy to accept Montenegro. It's a small country, small economy. They could pay you know, a salary to every single Montenegrin, and it wouldn't make a dent in anybody's budget. Turkey is 80 million, and it's got the Kurdish issue. Until we solve the Kurdish issue, it's very difficult for us to move forward in the EU path. And the Kurdish issue is complicated, and there's only one solution, which is a new political settlement. It's something that we all know cannot be solved militarily because there is a sociology that supports the PKK. And there are towns that are very much pro. So we have to, at some point, get back to the original plan on this. And I think that, again, right now, for both sides, the confrontation in urban areas is irrational. It's not going to win anybody. But I'm hoping that at some point, societies move away from irrational and move to a more rational.
Also, very clear. Why on earth NATO accepted Montenegro on these days where Turkey has a problem with Russia? Is there a message behind that? This is a very...
I think NATO wants Turkey. First of all, European countries are very worried about Russia, Estonia and Baltic states and countries on the fringes of the border, former Soviet republics also. They feel very unsafe, and they're willing to do anything they can to have, including Ukraine, to have a NATO umbrella. And I think that Montenegro and the Americans are moving in a very careful, ginger way. They really don't want to piss off Russians entirely, but they also want to provide protection. Right now, they've allowed Russians, as you can see, to annex Crimea and take half of Ukraine, but they're going to keep the other half. It's very much times for realpolitik. Montenegro is small potatoes. It's not going to make Putin go crazy. But I think the message to Turkey is, there is a message to Turkey, and that's about, and I know that privately, since the beginning of the Russian crisis, NATO and Americans and EU countries are telling Ankara and Russia, but also Ankara, don't take it further. We don't want this conflict right now. Tone it down. They're telling that to Putin, and they're telling that to Erdogan. Tone it down. This is happening at an inconvenient time. We need to focus on ISIS and Syria. So, there's a question here. Yes?
As you all know, U.S. foreign policy is about balancing local powers with each other, like in the past with Iran and Iraq, and Pakistan with India, etc. Do you perceive strengthening of Iran at the expense of Turkey in the next decade, or U.S. allowing Iran to get strengthened to balance Turkey in regional politics?
In perhaps Iraq and Syria and local theaters, yes, but not as a country, as an institution. Turkey's alliance with America is very multi-layered and institutional. There are bases, there's universities, there's Turkish students, etc. It's not something you can just, and with Iran, there's excitement now, but we're at the beginning stages of a very long road. What has happened, there is a good deal of frustration with Turkey in Washington. This is no secret. But still, Turkey is the best country, the most stable country, and the most important US ally, and an ally at the end of the day. The frustration, it's not easy to replace Iran with Turkey, not economically, not in terms of alliances, not in terms of institutions. But yes, people are interested in what Iran has to say. And the Shia, when I started studying Middle East politics, people treated the Shia and Iran as a problem in itself. So Shia Islam the mood is very much changing now in even academic circles. You know, okay, maybe, you know, Sunni fundamentalist radicalism, as in Al-Qaeda, ISIS, is the bigger problem. So you are having very much these fashions in academic thinking as well. I think Iran will be a very interesting country to watch also from an economic and trade aspect, and I do hope to see that. I hope the Turks could be stop wasting time with internal stuff, get their house in order, and actually be on the forefront of this new sort of path towards bringing Iran into the world economy. That would be the major story of the next decade. It's clear to everybody that Iraq will not be stabilized and Syria will not be stabilized without Iran. It was very important that people wanted Iran to be at the table in Vienna. And it's also true that the nuclear negotiations really are important, and I think Iranians were very smart in terms of accepting the deal that was on the offer. They negotiated a good deal. It's a big market that's waiting for the world. I think the energy companies are already interested, other companies are already interested, but Iranians are somewhat protective and peculiar. They want the regime, if there is peace to be made with, you remember the Turkish saying, if there's communism to be brought into the sky, it's going to be us. So the regime is, if there's peace to be made with the world, with the West, it's going to be through the prism of the regime, and we're not going to let everybody doing their own thing. So it's going to be a very controlled process. Will take longer. So tomorrow, Turkey, it's not going to be Turkey being replaced by Iran tomorrow. But let's revisit this question 10 years later. And I think it will be a more interesting question 10 years from now. Thank you. I think this is it. And thank you, everybody. And thanks for listening.